Today I would like to give you an overview of a recent project from Harvard Library's Weissman Preservation Center to conserve 145 bound account books of the Medici family. My presentation will be divided into 3 parts. I will discuss some preliminary results of the survey, followed by a few treatment techniques developed for this project, but let me start with a little history of the collection. In 1918, a group of records belonging to the descendants of one branch of the Medici family was auctioned at Christie's in London. The Italian government stopped the auction and preempted manuscripts which pertained primarily to art acquisitions for reasons of state, but allowed the sale of general business records. The remainder was offered again the next year, of which the majority was bought by Harry Gordon Selfridge, an American-born, London-based businessman. In 1927, Selfridge deposited the entire collection at Baker Library of the newly established Harvard Business School. Baker Library holds the largest collection of original business records, as well as the largest collection of Italian Renaissance business records outside of Italy. At Baker Library, the Medici family business records comprise 15 linear feet of account and letter books, as well as unbound manuscripts, covering a 200-range period from 1406 through 1597. The business records primarily focus on sheep, wool, and textile trade. The Medici bankers were some of the earliest to use double-entry bookkeeping, where each transaction requires 2 entries, one for credits and the other for debits, listed in 2 columns on the right. As an account is settled, its entry is slashed through, as we can see here. A renewed scholarly interest made conservation of the collection a curatorial priority. The goal was to make the volumes safe to handle by researchers while preserving their unique binding characteristics. At the start of the project, a literature review turned up very few published articles focusing on the structure of early Italian stationery bindings. In order to learn how the bindings were constructed, we spent extra time looking closely, documenting structural characteristics such as overbands, lacing patterns, tackets, sewing supports, and fastenings. The process of careful looking shed light on binding variations that could have been overlooked and illustrated trends in 15th and 16th century Italian stationery binding production. The great majority of the volumes were bound in limp parchment bindings, with overbands secured with decorative lacings and pentagonal flaps extending from the back cover. One binding uniquely had a blue textile chemise covering over a parchment binding. A small fraction were bound in stiff, laminated structures covered with tanned leather or alum-tawed skin. These covers had scalloped or wavy-edged flaps, but otherwise were structurally very similar to the parchment stationery bindings. The parchment covers were constructed from a single skin of parchment, folded with the whiter flesh side out and the darker hair side in. Typically, the whole animal skin was used with very little trimming of the natural parchment edge. The spine of the animal was positioned down the center of the binding, perpendicular to the spine of the book, with the neck often found along the foredge flap. Nearly a third of the bindings had the central overband reinforced with an additional piece of parchment, understandable since this area needed to be robust to support the fastening. An equal number had envelope flaps reinforced with an additional piece of parchment. Most covers were limp, though a small number had covers reinforced with cartonnage, but these predominantly were found in later 16th century bindings. 20% of the text blocks were sewn unsupported with a link stitch, but the majority of the text blocks were sewn over split thong supports. The stiff split thongs sewing supports were either tanned leather or alum-tawed skin, which was sometimes dyed. Very often in one volume, they would use a combination of tanned leather and alum-tawed skin simultaneously. The sewing supports are laced through the front cover and secured underneath the overbands, but left long inside the back cover, possibly to facilitate attaching additional gatherings if needed. Inbands were sewn separately over a core of rolled leather or tawed skin. The ends of the core were always cut off at the shoulder. The inbands were tacketed to the binding by looping over the core and knotting on the outside. Primary tacketed bindings were observed in only 20% of the collection, which correlates to the same 20% of unsupported sewn text blocks. But most often, the pattern that we found was this saltire pattern. Primary tackets entered the center, typically of the first and last gatherings, where you could find the ends twisted inside the gutter. Secondary tackets were used with text blocks sewn over sewing supports. Secondary tackets did not enter the text block, but instead passed behind the sewing supports. We can observe this easily here as gatherings were removed, but otherwise secondary tackets would be observed between the gatherings, as you see here. Secondary tackets exit the spine through the overbands and are twisted on the outside. The ends of the tackets pierce through the overbands a second time before being cut off. One of the most notable features of stationary bindings are the decorative lacing patterns, which secure the overbands to the case. We had difficulty finding any naming schemes for the different patterns, so we had to come up with our own. Two major patterns were observed, the double X with straight lines and the double X with loop center, which were noted in over 50% of the bindings. Other major patterns observed were a series of double X's, a double X with loop center, a big X with loop center, and the three-legged big X with loop center. Lacings were almost always executed in alum-tawed skin, though a small percentile were executed in a thin decorative ribbon. These instances only occurred on the front cover of the stiff laminated bindings, which I described earlier. The back covers of those bindings were always done in alum-tawed. We found a couple of patterns which occurred only once, and they often required a little creativity in describing or naming. There was an even distribution of covers which had the same pattern used throughout, and also versus different patterns being used from front to back. It was pretty equal 50-50. Over half of the bindings were fastened with strap and buckle. The center overband was left long across the back cover and extended into a strap which protrude from the flap, which was then used to attach to the buckle. Most buckles were made from iron, though several brass buckles were found as well. Strap and buckle closures were often fashioned with a keep or keeper, a small loop to hold the end of the strap. In many cases, this keep was broken off, but evidence was still available or visible if one knew what to look for. A smaller percentage of fastenings found were alum-tawed ties or loop and toggle. I want to speak a bit more about the loop and toggle. We found 19 examples of loop and toggle fastenings, but nearly all had missing loops, though some had replacement loops with cord. Initially, it was very difficult to determine how the loops were originally attached with little evidence visible or remaining. Finally, we stumbled upon 3 partial or intact loops. One only had a small dangling bit on the spine. The other had a single strand with its end wrapped around the toggle. But finally, we found one intact loop, though its toggle was missing. Upon closer inspection of the attachment method became clear. The loop ends were laced through the cover at the joint and twisted and anchored inside. 2 loop ends were found twisted inside the first gathering, which could easily be confused with primary spine tackets. 1 loop end was found twisted inside the front cover, barely visible as its ends had fallen behind the spine of the text block. With new knowledge in hand, we re-examined the volumes with missing loops. An extra twisted end inside the cover, some random holes along the joint, and a half-twisted end found inside a gathering were all that remained of these loops. Careful attention was required by the conservator to both stabilize and not disguise these teeny bits of evidence. I want to shift gears now and speak some about the treatment techniques developed for stabilizing the Medici collection. We were able to take a low intervention approach because volumes were part of a special collection. Access was limited and always supervised in the reading room. All volumes had paper labels with heavily inscribed iron gall ink numbers. These labels were applied unevenly across the spine and overbands. Spine movement and ink fragility caused many labels to fracture. Fragile labels were reinforced with solvent-set tissue prepared on mylar with Klucel G. These sheets could be held over the spine to precisely cut the desired shape. Once the adhesive was reactivated with ethanol, the tissue could be tamped in place with a small brush. A repair tissue was selected to match the paper tone, but it left a haze of fibers across the dark ink. Additionally, a dark-toned solvent-set tissue was used to improve the aesthetics of the mends, but also add a subsequent layer of support for the fragile ink. In cases of minor ink cracking, a single layer mend of toned solvent-set tissue was sufficient. And here we see a label before treatment, after a single layer of untoned solvent-set tissue, and a final layer of toned solvent-set tissue over the inked line at the bottom. One of the most vulnerable components of the stationary bindings are the lacings, especially on the back cover. We wanted to stabilize what remained of the lacings but not recreate missing components to complete the pattern. By observing the pattern of discoloration on the lacings and on the cover, lacings could be repositioned in front or behind each other as needed, sometimes even relacing through other elements. Broken lacing ends could be extended with a small piece of toned kozo paper adhered with wheat starch paste. The kozo paper was then rolled and folded around the end of the lacing and pressed into the hole from where it broke free. Careful observation during the survey made it very easy to determine the order and position of broken lacings and return them to their original state. 20% of the collection was severely damaged by rodents who preferentially chewed parchment components of the bindings, sometimes leaving only the overbands. The subsequent area of loss left the binding difficult to handle and the paper exposed and vulnerable to wear. In order to fill the losses, mylar templates were created and shaped to fit between the cover and the turn-ins, with slots to fit between the lacings and the tackets to secure it in place. These templates were then used to cut out the appropriate shape of parchment. Because the color of the cover varied wildly from inside to out, the template was crucial in delineating different tones as well as matching the folds of the cover. Parchment fills were toned with dilute acrylic paint and dried on the suction table. Fills were shaped and paired and fitted between the outer cover and the turn-ins. The attachment of the fill was primarily mechanical, with tabs fitting between the lacings in the overbands or the turn-in tackets, though adhesive was applied selectively where necessary to secure vulnerable edges that would move away from the cover when flexed. The Medici business records at the Harvard Business School is just a small sample in the greater realm of stationary bindings, but it is a starting point in understanding how these books are made. I hope that by sharing this project, It leads to further collaboration in developing a common language for describing unique features and leads to more extensive surveys and research into this field. Some next steps for this project is I will be doing some protein analysis with Dan Kirby, who spoke yesterday, hoping to identify what type of animal species was used for these bindings. At Baker Library, the next big project will be the conservation of the Barberini business records, and even though the bindings look very similar, we've already observed some very distinct structural differences. I would like to thank iada for inviting me to speak today, Laura Lennard and the Special Collections staff at Baker Library, my colleagues at the Weissman Preservation Center, and especially our interns and fellow who without their diligent help this project would not have been possible. Thank you.